Good morning. It's a beautiful morning. I hope everybody had a very nice celebration. Today is Zos Hanukkah. It's the eighth day of Hanukkah. It's the first time in over a week that we don't light the Hanukkah tonight, but it's a very powerful day, the final day of Hanukkah. I'm also very much in the mode of preparing for the Kabbalah of wellness. I would say the Kabbalah of emotional wellness, the new course. And so probably there'll be some kind of uh, something with regards to that'll come into today's class. So today we continue this riveting story of Joseph. Without going through the entire story, I want to kind of just focus on a couple of elements of it. The story of Joseph revealing himself to his brothers after decades of bitter separation. In my mind, is one of the most dramatic stories in the entire Torah. 22 years earlier, Joseph was just 17 years old. His brothers, despising their younger brother, kidnapped him, threw him in a pit, and sold him as a slave to what later were Egyptian merchants. In Egypt, he spends 12 years in prison, from where he rose to become the prime minister or the viceroy of the country. And Egypt was the superpower of the time. Now we're finally 2 decades later. And the moment is finally ripe. And I can only tell you the story in the words of the Torah. So I'm just going to open the Torah and I want to read it to you in English. Here it is. Joseph could not hold in his emotions. I'll say it again. Just think about it a second. Think about what's going on, this moment. The brothers have no idea who he is. Joseph could not hold in his emotions. He dismissed all of his Egyptian assistants from his chamber, so no one else was present with Joseph when he revealed himself to his brothers. He began to weep with such loud sobs that the Egyptians outside could hear him. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" His brothers were so horrified that they couldn't respond. And Joseph immediately responds. Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come close to me." And when they approached him, he said, "I am Joseph, your brother. It is me whom you sold into Egypt. Now, be not distressed, nor reproach yourself for having sold me here. For it was to be a provider that God sent me ahead of you. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival in the land and to sustain you for a momentous deliverance." That's the story. That's the whole thing. That's what you say after so many years. I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? And then follow up, don't worry, because it was all God's plan. I mean, is this the Joseph that I know, the Joseph that is so relatable? Would we have done that? Would you and I have done that had we been Joseph? Is this relatable? Can you connect to this? Emotions are not mathematical equations. Emotions are not equations that could be or should be subjected to academic scrutiny or analysis. Maybe a psychiatrist can do that, but I can't. Emotions are the texture through which we experience life in all of its majesty and all of its tragedy. We profess independent rules and a singular language, quite distinct of the calculated and structured ones of science. Yet we still feel compelled to tune into the particular phraseology that's employed by the Torah, a phraseology that describes this powerfully charged encounter when Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers. Now, I have four observations that come to mind. Maybe you'll have more, and if you do, please put it in the chat. But these are my four observations from this story. Number one, after Joseph exposes his identity to his brothers, he asks them to come close to him. And despite the fact that they were alone with him in a private room, Joseph wants them to approach even closer. And at this moment, we're expecting either Joseph to share with his brothers an intimate secret or to slap them. But neither of those seem to come. So why is he saying, come closer, when they're in the room alone? We know that already because he sends everybody away. So that's number one. Number two is after they approach him, Joseph says, I am your brother. It is me who you sold to Egypt. But he already told them that he was Joseph. He said before, I am Joseph, is my father still alive? Why does he say, I am Joseph, your brother? Again, the Torah is not repetitive. Number three, why did Joseph feel compelled to inform them that they sold him to the Egyptians, as though they were unaware of what they had done to their little brother? Why could he not immediately begin his explanation as to why they need not reproach themselves for selling him? And number four, the first time Joseph discloses himself, he doesn't define himself as their brother. But when he repeats himself again, he mentions the sense of brotherhood. I am Joseph, your brother. Why the difference? Why first I am Joseph and then I am Joseph, your brother? I'm going to try to make sense of all of this. The longest unbroken narrative in the entire Torah is from Genesis 37 to Genesis 50. And there can be no doubt that its hero, the hero of this story, is Joseph. The story begins with him, the story ends with him. We see him as a child, orphaned by his mother, and beloved by his father. We see him as an adolescent dreamer, resented by his brothers. We see him as a slave, as a prisoner in Egypt, and then as the second most powerful figure in the greatest empire in the ancient world. Andrew Lloyd Webber was onto something. At every stage of Joseph's life, The narrative revolves around him and his impact on others. He dominates the last third of the book of Genesis. He casts a shadow on everyone else. We know very little of his brothers. Throughout the entire Torah, throughout the entire Bible, there's nobody that we actually know as intimately as Joseph. I would say, just as an observer, the Torah seems to be infatuated with Joseph, infatuated with his journeys and his struggles, more than with any other figure. I'm saying on an emotional level, we know more emotionally about Joseph than anyone else. And maybe even more with the two pillars of Jewish faith, Abraham and Moses. We don't know that much about their emotional states or their entire lives. Like even Abraham, the story of Abraham starts when he's born, and then the next Torah portion, he's 75. Like we know nothing of the middle part of the main part of his life. So what's the mystique behind Joseph? Who is Joseph? That's what I want to talk about today. I think Joseph's life embodies the entire drama and paradox of human existence. Joseph on the outside was not Joseph on the inside. His outer behavior never did justice to his authentic inner grace. Already as a young teen, his brothers weren't able to appreciate the depth and the nobility of his character. The Midrash understands this. And the Midrash explains that the Torah's description of Joseph at the age of 17 as a young boy is to indicate that he devoted a lot of time to fixing his hair and to grooming his eyes and measuring his every step. Joseph appeared to most people around him as spoiled and pompous. And then when Joseph rose to become the viceroy of Egypt, he donned the persona of this charismatic statesman, a handsome, charming, and powerful young leader, a skilled diplomat, a savvy politician with great ambition. It wasn't easy to realize that beneath these qualities, there was a soul on fire with moral passion, a kindred spirit for whom the monotheistic legacy of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah remained the epicenter of his life. A heart overwhelmed with love toward God. A young slave in a foreign country. He will not betray his moral integrity, even in the face of profound temptation. And throughout his life's journey, he's filled with joy. He's filled with faith. He's filled with resilience. And the Torah emphasizes this again and again. And every time I read it, I can't help but think, I want some of that. I want some of that joy. I want some of that resilience. And my gosh, how much we need it now. Joseph's life is poignantly expressed in one biblical verse. The Torah says, Joseph recognized his brothers, but they didn't recognize him. Joseph easily identified the holiness within his brothers. Remember, they hadn't seen each other since they were very young, or since he was very young. And after all, they lived most of their lives isolated as spiritual shepherds. The patriarchs, and they loved being shepherds because they were able to be involved in prayer and meditation and study for most of the day. That's why they chose that as a profession. Yet these very brothers, these very spiritually heightened brothers, lack the ability to discern the moral richness that was etched in the depths of Joseph's heart. And even when Joseph was living with them in Israel, they saw him as an outsider, as a danger to the integrity of the family of Israel. And when they encountered him in the form of an Egyptian leader, they failed to observe beyond the mask of a savvy politician. They couldn't see the heart of a tzaddik, the soul of a great Rebbe. And I think this dual identity that characterized Joseph's life played itself out in the most powerful way when his master's wife attempted to seduce him. On the outside, she thought it wouldn't be very difficult to entice a young, abandoned slave into sacrificing his moral integrity for the sake of attention, for the sake of romance, for fun. But when push came to shove, when Joseph was presented with the test of tests, he displayed heroic courage, and he resisted and fled from her. And as a result of that act, he ends up in prison for 12 years. The Midrash, when talking about Joseph, compares Joseph to the fresh wellspring of water that's hidden in the depth of the earth, and it's eclipsed by layers of debris and gravel. On the opposite metaphor, making the identical point, Kabbalah sees Joseph as the blaze hidden within the coal. On the outside, the coal seems cold, but when you expose yourself to its true texture, you sense the heat, the fire, the passion, to the point where you can even burn yourself. And then the moment came when Joseph removed his mask. The Zohar, which really is, yes, the magnum opus of Kabbalah, but it's more than just the magnum opus of Kabbalah. It's the basic Kabbalistic commentary on the Torah. So the Zohar talks about this, and it presents a penetrating visualization of what happened, what transpired at the moment when Joseph exposed himself to his brothers. When Joseph said, "I am Joseph," the Zohar says, the brothers observed the divine light radiating from his face. They witnessed the majestic glow emanating from his heart. Joseph's words, the Zohar says, "I am Joseph," weren't a revelation of who he was. Well, they were a revelation of who he was, but they weren't just a revelation of who he was. They were also a revelation of what he was. For the first time in their lives, Joseph allowed his brothers to see what he really was. "I am Joseph," the Zohar says, should be understood in a sense of, look at me and you will discover who Joseph is. Joseph cries out, "I am Joseph." His face became ablaze like a fiery furnace. The burning flame concealed for 39 years within the coal emerged in its full, dazzling splendor. For the first time in their entire lives, Joseph's brothers saw a raw and naked Joseph. They came in contact with the greatest holiness in the world that was emerging from the face of an Egyptian viceroy. What does the Torah say? His brothers were so horrified, they couldn't respond. What perturbed the brothers was not so much the sense of fear and personal guilt. What horrified them more than anything else was the sense of loss they felt for themselves and for the entire world as a result of Joseph's sale into Egypt. If after spending 22 years in a morally depraved society, 1 year as a slave, 12 years as a prisoner, 9 years as a politician, Joseph still retained such a profound holiness, such a profound passion, how much holier might he have been if he spent those 22 years in the hands of his saintly father Jacob? What a loss to history our actions brought about. The brothers were tormented. If Joseph could have spent all these years in the transcended oasis, in the sacred environment, in the spiritual island of the patriarch Jacob, of his father, how the world might have been enriched with such an atomic glow of holiness in its midst. Contrasting Joseph's present condition with maybe what could have been his potential. That's what left the brothers with this irreplaceable loss by what they sensed was a missed opportunity of historic proportions. And at this moment, Joseph says to his brothers, "Please come close to me." Joseph wanted them to approach even closer and gaze deeper into the divine light that was coming forth from his face. And when they approached him, the Torah says, he said, "I am Joseph, your brother. It is me who you sold to Egypt." Joseph wasn't repeating what he had told them earlier. We know what he said earlier. "I am Joseph." He was not informing them of the fact that they were well aware of, that they sold him into Egypt. He was responding to their sense of irrevocable loss. The words, "I am Joseph, your brother. It is me who you sold into Egypt." In the original Hebrew, you can also translate as, "I am Joseph, your brother, because you sold me into Egypt." It's a little bit of a nuanced change, but a huge difference. What Joseph was stating was the powerfully moving message that the only reason he reached such a tremendous spiritual height is because he spent the last 22 years in Egypt, not in Jacob's sacred environment. The awesome glow that was emanating from his presence was not there despite his 2 decades in a lowly Egyptian society, despite his 2 decades far removed from his father's celestial paradise. It came precisely as a result of his entanglement with life, alien to the innocent and straightforward paths of his brothers. The incredible trials and tribulations, the adversity he faced in the spiritual jungle are precisely what unleashed that atomic glow. The one that his brothers are now taking in. Had Joseph spent the 2 decades with his father, he would not have had the same emotional and psychological growth. He would not have been able to reach the great intellectual and emotional heights. It was only through his confrontation with the glaring abyss that gave Joseph that singular majesty, the passion, the power that defied even the rich imagination of his brothers. And that's why Joseph says, "Come close to me," so they can behold from closer up this unique light and appreciate that this was the light that could only emerge from the depths of darkness, from the pit of Egyptian promiscuity. It's also, just by the way, the reason for Joseph mentioning the second time around the element of brotherhood, because Joseph was attempting not only to tell them who he was, but to share the reality of their kinship, the fact that he, like them, was deeply connected to his spiritual roots. And what about you and me? What does this teach us? I think, just like the brothers, many of us too live our lives thinking, if only, maybe the day after New Year's. Oh, gosh, we're thinking, where did the year go? If only my circumstances would have been different. If only I was born into a different type of family, maybe a different city. If only I had a better personality. If only it was a little warmer outside. The eternal lesson that I can share with you today, the eternal lesson of Joseph, is that the individual journey of life, in all of its ups and downs, is what will ultimately allow you to discover your unique place in this world. It's because of what happened to you. It's because of who you are. It's because of all of life's trials and tribulations. And that's why I continue to say, and I will continue to say, that Joseph is the greatest story ever told. That's why Joseph is so relatable. Because we too, if only we could learn from Joseph, if only we could experience life through Joseph's eyes, if only we could come out of all of our trials and tribulations with the narrative that Joseph came out with. If only we could look at his life and be able to look at our brothers who sold us into slavery after 22 years and say, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? For those of you who are going to be spending time with me over the next few weeks in this beautiful new course, we're going to go into great depths, analyzing a lot of these emotional elements. I'm very excited, actually. I just recorded the first lesson. It's an hour and a half long, so prepare yourself. And it's probably one you're going to have to watch with a paper and pen in front of you. Joseph still is the greatest story ever told. And my prayer as we enter this beautiful new year and this time when we think about resolutions, my prayer to you today, and my blessing to you, is that it's not by chance that Joseph's story is told now at the beginning of a new year at a time when we're thinking of change. And maybe the change that we need in our lives is not physical change, it's just a narrative change. To take the way that we're looking at it and put the emphasis on the right syllable. I wish you a beautiful Shabbat, a beautiful end of Hanukkah, and a beautiful New Year.